The summer of 1980 had been like any other in the quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and neighbors trusted their doors unlocked. Parents felt at ease sending their children to the church, a sacred space that represented safety, faith, and guidance. Among the youth of the parish were 11 boys who took on the honor of being altar servers. For them, it wasn't just a duty, it was a badge of pride, a chance to stand close to the rituals of the church and to be seen as responsible young men in the eyes of the community. On the evening it all began, the boys gathered at the church as they had countless times before, preparing for evening mass. Their parents lingered outside, chatting idly with one another, expecting the children to finish and come running out, chattering and laughing as they always did. No one could have imagined that this would be the last time the boys would be seen together. Inside the church, the boys were said to be assisting the priest, carrying out their familiar routines. They lit candles, carried incense, adjusted robes, and moved about the altar with the ease of practice. Some were barely 10 years old, others in their early teens, their youthful energy muted only by the reverence expected within the sacred space. To the congregation, nothing seemed unusual. It was an ordinary evening, with prayers spoken and hymns sung. But somewhere between the end of Mass and the quieting of the pews, the 11 boys simply disappeared. At first, no one noticed. Parents assumed the boys were finishing chores inside or lingering in the sacristy. Minutes stretched into an hour, and still no children came out. Concern grew quickly, turning into panic. Parents went inside the church, searching the pews, the confessional, and the side rooms, calling out their sons' names, their voices echoing against stone walls. The church, usually filled with warmth and light, felt suddenly cold and hollow. The priest, calm yet strangely dismissive, insisted the boys must have slipped out the back or wandered off together. But the parents knew better, these were obedient boys, raised to follow instructions, unlikely to vanish without a word. By nightfall, the search spread across town. Flashlights cut through the darkness as fathers combed the streets and fields, while mothers went door to door in desperation. The police joined in, though at first they treated it as if the boys had run away or gone off on a childish adventure. But as the hours turned into dawn, it became clear that this was no simple case of mischief. 11 children, all linked by their service to the church, had vanished without leaving a trace. The community was shaken to its core. Fear took root where once there had been trust. Parents clutched their remaining children tighter, whispering prayers while demanding answers from authorities. The church, once a sanctuary, became the center of whispered suspicions. Some recalled uneasy moments with the priest, small things they had brushed aside. Others dismissed the notion that anything sinister could happen within holy walls. But the undeniable truth was there. 11 families were broken overnight, robbed of sons who had been full of laughter, energy, and innocence only hours before. The days that followed were filled with chaos and heartbreak. Posters with the boys' faces appeared on lampposts, in grocery stores, and outside schools. Volunteers joined searches through forests, rivers, and abandoned buildings, but not a shred of evidence surfaced. It was as if the ground had swallowed them whole. The media arrived, their cameras capturing the grief of mothers and the frustration of fathers as they pleaded for help. Rumors swirled like wildfire. Had the boys been kidnapped, lured away, or taken by someone within the community itself? For the families, hope battled despair. Mothers refused to pack away their sons' belongings, keeping their rooms intact, as though the boys might walk back through the door at any moment. Fathers grew restless, blaming themselves for trusting too much in the sanctity of the church. Every night, the sound of weeping could be heard through the town, a chorus of grief that bound the families together in their suffering. The disappearance of the altar boys marked the beginning of a wound that would never fully heal. It shattered the illusion of safety, stripping away the innocence of both children and parents alike. The town, once defined by its faith and community spirit, now carried a shadow, a haunting reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors happen in the places we trust most. And as the years would show, the truth of what had happened inside the church would prove darker than anyone dared to imagine. The years after the disappearance of the 11 altar boys were defined by an unbearable quiet that pressed down on the town like a suffocating weight. In the immediate aftermath, the streets had been alive with frantic searches, with parents running from one corner to the next, calling out names into the darkness, and neighbors joining them with flashlights and lanterns. Reporters had swarmed the church, filling newspapers and television screens with the faces of the missing boys. Police officers, though clearly overwhelmed, had promised answers. For a while, the energy of hope kept grief at bay. But as weeks turned into months and months stretched into years, the voices that once shouted into the night grew quieter, until there was only silence. The case slowly slipped into the background of official records. Investigators, faced with a lack of leads and evidence, began pulling away. The families noticed the shift, first in the way meetings grew shorter, then in how phone calls went unreturned, and finally in the way the officers seemed to avoid eye contact when passing them on the street. The explanation that eventually hardened into the official narrative was vague. Perhaps the boys had been taken by strangers, spirited away from the town by forces outside anyone's control. It was a story that shifted blame elsewhere, one that excused the failure to protect the children. But deep down, the families knew that something was wrong with that story. The boys hadn't been wandering the streets that night, they had been in the church, under the supervision of a man trusted by everyone. The priest remained in his position, offering consoling words to the congregation, urging them to stay strong in their faith and to avoid succumbing to rumor. To some, his calmness seemed like leadership in a time of chaos. To others, it was chilling, as though he carried no burden at all for being the last person to see the children alive. There were whispers among parents, small fragments of suspicion that escaped in hushed conversations. Some recalled how uncomfortable they had felt when the priest lingered around the boys, or the strange way he sometimes looked at them. Yet those whispers never became public accusations. The church carried too much power, and the fear of being cast out, of being labeled faithless, silenced many tongues. The institution stood like an impenetrable wall, and behind it, the priest was shielded from scrutiny. The parents bore the brunt of the silence. Each home carried its own private grief. Some mothers left the boys' rooms untouched, beds made neatly, toys still arranged as though waiting for small hands to return. Fathers often buried themselves in work or fell into quiet despair, their sorrow gnawing at their strength. The absence of the children eroded families. Marriages collapsed, and siblings grew up in the shadow of loss. Birthdays were observed like funerals, with candles lit not on cakes but at vigils. Holidays became empty rituals where laughter was replaced by tears. The photographs of the boys grew older while their parents aged into weary figures, still waiting, still hoping, even as years slipped through their fingers. The town itself was never the same. Where once neighbors had shared trust and camaraderie, suspicion now simmered. Some clung fiercely to the church, defending it against any suggestion of wrongdoing, believing that to question it was to question God himself. Others grew quietly resentful, convinced that the truth was being buried along with their children. That division seeped into every part of the community. Friendships fractured, businesses suffered, and a sense of unease hovered over daily life. The church's towering steeple no longer symbolized safety, it cast a long, cold shadow over the town. Time passed, and new children were born, growing up with the story of the altar boys as a warning whispered at bedtime. They learned not to stray after dark, not to trust too easily, not to forget the faces of the 11 who had vanished. The tragedy became both history and legend, retold at gatherings in voices heavy with sorrow. Outsiders who moved into the town noticed the way conversations hushed when the church was mentioned, how a strange heaviness lingered in the air, how old photographs of smiling boys hung in hallways like ghosts that refused to leave. When the priest eventually died, he was buried with honor, his coffin lowered into the churchyard as the congregation prayed. For the grieving families, watching his funeral was like swallowing glass. They stood there, the weight of their suspicions unspoken, watching as the man who had been the last link to their children was laid to rest without ever having to answer their questions. It was not closure, but another wound, another reminder that the silence surrounding the disappearance had become permanent. By the time 26 years had passed, the case was considered unsolvable by nearly everyone except the parents who refused to let go. Their children were frozen in time, their faces forever young in fading photographs, while the rest of the world moved on. But silence is fragile, and secrets buried too long have a way of forcing themselves back into the light. What seemed like a tragedy destined to remain a mystery was waiting, just beneath the surface, to erupt with revelations far darker than anyone in the town was prepared to face. It began quietly, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, the kind of murmur that people at first ignored but that slowly grew into something no one could look away from. After more than 2 decades of silence, a retired officer who had worked the case in its earliest days came forward with his own gnawing doubts. He had kept copies of notes that never made it into the official reports, small details that had been brushed aside when the church insisted on moving the investigation in another direction. One of those details was a janitor who claimed he saw the priest carrying heavy sacks out to the churchyard late at night, long after the congregation had gone home. Another was a parishioner who had reported hearing strange noises behind the rectory walls. Back then, these accounts had been dismissed as unreliable, but now, after so many years of unanswered questions, they began to take on new weight. The families, still grieving and growing older, seized on these fragments like lifelines. They wrote letters, demanded new inquiries, and begged officials to revisit the case. At first, their pleas seemed to fall on deaf ears, just as they had for decades. But the climate had changed. The early 2000s were marked by growing scandals in the church worldwide, and stories of abuse and cover-ups were making headlines. What had once been unthinkable was now undeniable. Against this backdrop, the whispers surrounding the disappearance of the altar boys suddenly demanded attention. The FBI was called in, quietly at first, their presence in town discreet, their questions careful. Agents sifted through dusty boxes of old case files, piecing together fragments that had long been forgotten. They noticed inconsistencies in the priest's testimony, strange gaps in timelines, and an unusual lack of documentation surrounding the night the boys vanished. Witnesses who had been young at the time, now middle-aged, began to remember things they had buried deep. One man recalled sneaking a cigarette near the churchyard and seeing candlelight flickering in the rectory windows long after services had ended. Another, once a boy himself, admitted he had been afraid of the priest, though he never dared to explain why. The investigation moved carefully, for the church still held influence in the town, and any suggestion of wrongdoing sparked anger from loyal parishioners. But beneath that loyalty was fear, and in some cases, guilt. A handful of people who had stayed silent for decades finally came forward. They spoke of whispers about the priest's behavior, of warnings passed between parents in hushed tones, of uneasy feelings that were brushed aside because no one dared to question a man of God. These confessions painted a disturbing picture, one the authorities could no longer ignore. As the FBI dug deeper, patterns emerged. Records showed the priest had moved several times before settling in the town, and in each place he had left behind rumors, though nothing ever proven. The more they uncovered, the more it seemed that the disappearance of the altar boys was not a random tragedy but something orchestrated, deliberate, and hidden under layers of silence and fear. The community was thrown into turmoil once again. Old wounds were torn open, and families relived their grief as reporters returned, thrusting microphones into faces that had grown weary with loss. The church urged calm, insisting that no evidence had yet been found, but the cracks in its facade were widening. People began to wonder aloud what had really happened in 1980, and whether the priest, long buried and remembered by some as a shepherd of faith, had in fact been hiding the darkest of secrets. The decision to take the investigation further did not come easily. Exhuming the dead was no small matter, especially when the grave belonged to a man once revered in the community. But the weight of testimony, the inconsistencies in records, and the pain etched into the faces of the surviving families pushed the case forward. Agents knew they had to uncover the truth, no matter how much it disturbed the fragile peace the town had built around its silence. For the families, this new investigation reignited a mixture of emotions, hope that answers might finally come, and dread of what those answers might reveal. Mothers who had grown old still clutched faded photographs of their sons, while fathers, now gray and stooped, whispered prayers that justice would be done before they left this world. The idea that the truth might have been lying just beneath their feet all these years filled them with both rage and sorrow. What began as whispers had grown into a storm, and the FBI's presence in the town was no longer a secret. Eyes followed the agents wherever they went, and the churchyard became the center of speculation. The exhumation order was signed, and the town braced itself for what was to come. For 26 years, silence had held its grip, but now, the past was clawing its way to the surface. And when the earth was opened, what lay beneath would shatter any illusions the town still clung to about innocence, faith, and the man they had once trusted with their children. The morning the FBI arrived at the churchyard to carry out the exhumation, the town seemed to hold its breath. For days, rumors had spread like wildfire, speculation circling from kitchen tables to street corners, from grocery stores to the pews of the very church at the center of it all. Some people called it blasphemy, desecrating the grave of a priest who had served the parish faithfully. Others whispered that this was the moment the truth, long buried, would finally claw its way out of the ground. By dawn, clusters of townsfolk had gathered at a distance, their eyes fixed on the section of the churchyard roped off with yellow tape. The autumn air was cold, heavy with anticipation and the sharp scent of freshly disturbed soil. The grave stood solemn and unassuming, the priest's name etched into a weathered headstone that bore words of reverence. For years, people had left flowers here, small tokens of respect to a man who had led them in prayer, baptized their children, and buried their dead. Now, the same stone looked like a mask, hiding something far darker beneath it. Agents in dark jackets moved with quiet determination, their tools and equipment laid out with precision. The families of the 11 altar boys stood off to the side, some clutching rosaries, others simply staring, their faces lined with decades of grief and exhaustion. For them, this was not about desecration, it was about answers, no matter how horrifying. When the first shovel pierced the earth, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Each scrape of metal against soil felt amplified in the silence, each clump of dirt lifted from the ground a step closer to a truth no one wanted but everyone needed. The digging went on for hours. Reporters, unable to get close, lingered on the edges, cameras ready to capture every moment. The priest's coffin, once thought to be a place of eternal rest, slowly emerged from the dirt, its wood damp and darkened with age, the handles corroded from decades underground. The sight of it brought mixed emotions. For some, it was unsettling to see a coffin dragged into the daylight. For others, it was a moment of grim justice, long overdue. When the coffin was finally lifted and placed onto a platform, the agents moved with solemn care. Crowds pressed closer, their breaths fogging in the cold air. The families gripped one another's hands, steeling themselves. The lid, heavy and creaking, was pried open under the watchful eyes of officials and townsfolk alike. What they found inside silenced the crowd in an instant. At first glance, the remains of the priest lay as expected, his bones neatly settled, his garments still clinging faintly to form. But it did not take long for the trained eyes of the forensic team to see what no one could deny. Mixed within the coffin, tangled in unnatural ways, were bones that did not belong to one man. Smaller bones. Bones that bore the undeniable shape of children. The air seemed to collapse around the onlookers. Gasps broke the silence, followed by cries of anguish from mothers who had waited 26 years for even the faintest trace of their sons. The horror of the discovery was both unbearable and undeniable. The agents worked quickly, documenting everything, marking and separating remains with gloved hands, their faces grim but steady. Forensic experts whispered among themselves, confirming suspicions that the bones belonged to multiple individuals. The sheer violation of what lay before them was overwhelming, the idea that the priest's coffin had served not only as his resting place but also as a grotesque hiding ground for the innocent. The crowd's reactions split like the town itself had for decades. Some clutched their mouths, unable to look, their faith shattered by the evidence in plain sight. Others turned away in anger, cursing the church they had defended for so long. And then there were those who still tried to deny what their eyes showed them, muttering about conspiracies, about misunderstandings, as if denial could shield them from the truth. But denial was no longer possible. The silence of 26 years had been broken in the most devastating way. For the families, grief surged anew. Some wept openly, others stood rigid, their tears refusing to fall, their hearts too numb to allow release. Fathers clenched fists as if trying to hold on to some fragment of control, while mothers clung to one another for strength. They had come seeking answers, and now they had them, but the truth was so grotesque that it left them broken in new ways. The agents closed the coffin once more, preparing to move the remains for further examination. The churchyard, once a place of solemn peace, was now a crime scene. The headstone, once a symbol of honor, now stood as a marker of betrayal. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the weight of what had been uncovered lingered in the air, settling over the town like a curse. That night, the church stood empty, its doors closed and its windows dark. For the first time in memory, no candles were lit, no hymns were sung. The community that had once gathered here for faith now recoiled from it, haunted by the knowledge of what had been hidden beneath its soil. The exhumation had answered one question: What became of the altar boys, but it left behind 1,000 more? Was the priest acting alone? How many people had known and chosen silence? And how could a sanctuary of God conceal such darkness for so long? The discovery was not the end of the story but the beginning of its most disturbing chapter. The truth had finally been unearthed, and it was more horrifying than even the families had imagined. The grave had not only been opened in the earth, it had been opened in the hearts of everyone in the town, leaving scars that would never heal. The remains taken from the exhumed coffin were transported under heavy security to a forensic lab, where experts worked tirelessly to examine and identify what lay hidden for more than 2 decades. The priest's skeleton was there, as expected, but intermingled with it were bones too small, too fragile to belong to a grown man. Piece by piece, they were separated, cleaned, and catalogued, and the horrifying truth emerged: there were remains of multiple children. Forensic experts confirmed what the grieving families had feared all along. The boys had never left the church, never wandered off into the night, never been stolen by strangers. Their lives had ended within the very place they had been taught to trust most. When the news broke, it swept across the town like wildfire. People who had once defended the church, who had dismissed whispers of wrongdoing, now found themselves facing a truth they could not deny. Shock turned to anger, and anger to shame. Families who had stood by the priest, who had scolded neighbors for suspicion, now felt complicit in their silence. For the parents of the altar boys, the discovery was both a blessing and a curse. They finally had an answer to the question that had haunted them for 26 years, but the answer was so vile, so cruel, that it offered no comfort, only fresh grief. The church became the epicenter of outrage. Crowds gathered outside, demanding accountability, their chants echoing against the stone walls. Reporters filled the town once again, microphones shoved in faces. Cameras flashing. National headlines carried the story, labeling it one of the darkest scandals in the history of faith in the country. The diocese released statements urging prayer and patience, but their words rang hollow. Trust had been shattered, and every line of reassurance sounded like another attempt at cover-up. The coffin had exposed more than bones, it had exposed the rot beneath the surface of an institution that had shielded one of its own at the expense of innocent children. The FBI pressed forward, determined to uncover the full truth. Investigators combed through records, searching for signs of accomplices. Could one man alone have committed such acts and concealed them for so long? Or had others within the church known, choosing silence over scandal? Rumors spread of missing reports, of warnings ignored by higher authorities, of complaints buried in files that never reached the light of day. The more the agents uncovered, the clearer it became that the priest had not simply been a solitary monster, but part of a system that enabled him by refusing to question, refusing to act. For the families, the process of identifying the remains was agonizing. DNA tests were conducted, each result bringing both closure and heartbreak. When a match was found, parents received the call they had both longed for and dreaded. Some finally laid their sons to rest properly, burying them with the honor and dignity denied to them in death. Others received only fragments, partial remains that served as a cruel reminder of how much had been lost. Every funeral became a public reckoning, with mourners filling the cemeteries, the sound of weeping carrying across the fields. The town, once bound by shared faith, was now united by grief and anger. The revelations tore open wounds that had never healed. People who had lived in denial for years now admitted to uneasy feelings they had ignored. Former altar boys came forward with stories of discomfort, of moments with the priest that seemed wrong but had been brushed aside at the time. Each testimony painted a clearer picture of a predator shielded by silence. The shame of the community deepened, as people wondered how they could have missed the signs, or worse, how they had chosen not to see them. Beyond the town, the scandal spread, fueling wider outrage against the church. Activists demanded reform, investigations, accountability. Politicians weighed in, promising justice. But for the families, all the noise from the outside world mattered little. Their pain was intimate, personal, carved into them in ways that no trial or apology could ever heal. For them, justice was not about headlines or statements, it was about the 11 boys who had been robbed of their futures, their laughter silenced within sacred walls. The church doors, once a symbol of sanctuary, now stood as a reminder of betrayal. Attendance dwindled to nothing, pews sat empty, candles remained unlit. Some parishioners tore down crosses from their walls at home, unwilling to pray to an institution that had harbored such horror. Faith itself was shaken, leaving many to question everything they had once believed in. The town's identity, built around its church, crumbled into dust. Even as investigations continued, one truth remained undeniable: the disappearance of the altar boys had never been a mystery of strangers or chance. It had been a crime rooted in trust, committed in the very heart of the community, and hidden beneath the soil of its most sacred place. The exhumation had uncovered bones, but it had also unearthed the weight of decades of silence, complicity, and betrayal. For the families, the only piece they could cling to was that their children's truth had finally come to light. But the darkness that truth revealed would linger over the town forever, a scar that no amount of time could erase.